The silence in the enclave was a manufactured thing, a sterile blanket woven from the hum of air recyclers and the muted pulse of the life support grid. It was a silence designed to soothe, to pacify, to control. For Elian, it was the sound of a cage. He stood at attention, spine a rigid line of compliance, his gaze fixed on the grey, seamless wall of the briefing chamber. He did not need to look to know the commander was watching him. He could feel it, a physical weight settling between his shoulder blades, a prickling heat that had nothing to do with the regulated temperature of the room. It was an awareness that lived under his skin, a constant, low-frequency hum of dread and a terrifying, nameless curiosity. Commander Kale was a monolith of an alpha, carved from stillness and authority. He rarely spoke, his orders delivered in a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the composite floor and up into the bones of those who served him. His presence was absolute, a gravitational force that bent the pack to his will. The other alphas, 20 of them in total, stood in perfect formation, their uniforms crisp, their expressions impassive. They were a legion of polished steel and disciplined power. And then there was Elian, Unit 734, the Omega, the anomaly. He was the only one. In a facility designed for alpha dominance and tactical superiority, he was a statistical error, a ghost in the machine. The Directorate had assigned him here after the outlying settlements had been consolidated. That was the official term. Elian remembered it differently. He remembered fire and the scent of ozone-laced fear. He remembered being herded, catalogued, and processed. His designation, a brand seared into his file. Omega, a liability, a creature of instinct and vulnerability in a world that prized cold logic and strength. Here in the Enclave, they had tried to scrub the Omega from him. Daily injections of scent suppressants left him a blank slate, a ghost in the olfactory landscape. Hormonal regulators flattened his emotional responses into a manageable, placid baseline. They had tried to make him a functional cog, another piece of grey machinery, but they could not erase the feeling of being watched. Kyle's gaze was different from the others. The other alphas looked at him with a mixture of contempt, pity, or a cold, clinical disinterest. They saw a broken thing, a lesser being kept on a tight leash. Kale's gaze held none of that. It was something else entirely. It was intense, analytical, and unnervingly patient. It was the look of a predator studying unfamiliar prey, not with hunger, but with an unnerving, intellectual focus. He wasn't just looking at Elian, he was dissecting him, layer by layer, with nothing but the force of his attention. Unit 112, report on Sector Gamma's perimeter integrity. Kale's voice cut through the silence, each word precise, devoid of inflection. An alpha named Rorik stepped forward half a pace. Perimeter secure, Commander. No anomalies detected in the last rotation. Energy signatures remain stable. And the atmospheric processor in sub-level 3. Repairs completed at 0400 hours. All systems are nominal, Rorik replied, his voice a low growl of efficiency. He was Kale's second, an alpha whose ambition was a poorly veiled thing. His dislike for Elian was palpable, a static charge in the air whenever he was near. Elian kept his breathing even, a measured inhale and exhale that he had perfected into a shield. He focused on the tiny imperfections in the wall in front of him, the faint whirls where the composite material had been poured. Anything to anchor him, to keep the tremor from starting in his hands. The commander's attention was a physical thing. He could feel it sweeping the room, assessing each alpha, but it always came back to him. It lingered. It probed. It was a violation that left no marks. The briefing continued, a litany of reports and directives that flowed around Elian like a river around a stone. He was present, but not a participant. His function was nebulous, his duties confined to data collation and archival maintenance, tasks that kept him isolated, tucked away in the Enclave's digital heart. He was a librarian in a barracks of soldiers. The absurdity of it was a bitter pill he swallowed each morning along with his suppressants. Then the briefing was over. "Dismissed," Kale said. The word was a clean, sharp blade. The alphas moved as one, turning with synchronized precision and filing out of the chamber. Their discipline was a work of art, a testament to the Enclave's conditioning. Elian waited, as he always did, for the room to empty. It was an unspoken rule. He was the last to enter, the last to leave. The Dreg. But today, as Rorik passed him, the Alpha's shoulder brushed his with intentional force, a small, petty act of dominance. Elian's body tensed, a reflexive recoil, but he held his ground, his eyes remaining fixed on the wall. He would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The heavy door slid shut, leaving him alone in the briefing chamber. Or so he thought. The soft click of the magnetic lock echoed in the sudden, deeper silence. He finally allowed himself to breathe, a shaky, controlled exhale. But the feeling of being watched remained, more potent than ever. He turned slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Commander Kale stood by the central holographic console, his back to Elian. He hadn't left. He was a silhouette against the cool blue light of the tactical display, his broad shoulders filling the frame of his severe black uniform. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, and Elian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that all of his attention was focused on him. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. Elian's training screamed at him to remain still, to await orders, to be invisible. But his instincts, buried deep beneath layers of chemical suppression and psychological conditioning, screamed something else. They screamed danger. Finally, Kyle spoke, his voice quiet in the empty room, yet it seemed to fill every corner. "Unit 734. Commander." Elian's voice was a dry rasp. He hated how small it sounded. Kyle turned his head slightly, his profile etched by the console's light. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, were fixed on him. "Your biometric readings were elevated throughout the briefing. Heart rate above baseline, respiration shallow. Report the cause." It was not a question. It was a demand for data. Elian felt a surge of cold fury, quickly suppressed. He was a machine to be monitored, a system to be diagnosed. "Apologies, Commander. A momentary lapse in regulation. It will be corrected." Kyle turned fully then, and the full weight of his presence fell upon Elian. He took a slow step forward, his polished boots making no sound on the floor. "A lapse," he repeated, the word tasting of disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Elian could see the silver insignia on his collar, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. Even through the suppressants, Kale's scent was a powerful, undeniable thing. Ozone, cold steel, and something else, something ancient and wild, like a forest after a winter storm. It was the scent of absolute alpha authority. It should have sent him into a submissive panic. Instead, it made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end with a strange, defiant energy. "I have reviewed your file," Kale continued, his gaze unwavering. Your performance scores in cognitive and analytical tasks are exemplary, highest in the enclave, yet your physical readiness assessments are consistently borderline. Your autonomic responses are volatile. He tilted his head, a gesture of cold curiosity. You are a contradiction, Unit 734. Elian's jaw tightened. He was not a contradiction. He was an Omega in a cage, and his body was screaming, even if his voice could not. I perform my duties to the best of my ability, Commander. Your ability is not what is in question. Kyle took another step. He was too close now. The air crackled. What is in question is the nature of your condition. He reached out, his gloved hand moving with deliberate slowness, and for one heart-stopping moment, Elian thought he was going to touch him. He braced himself, a lifetime of fear and trauma coiling in his gut. But Kyle's hand stopped just an inch from his face. His focus was not on Elian's eyes, but on the pulse beating frantically at his throat. Your suppressants are administered at the maximum safe dosage, Kyle murmured, more to himself than to Elian. And still, the system struggles to contain you. His eyes finally lifted to meet Elian's. For the first time, Elian saw something beyond the cold, analytical. Commander. He saw a flicker of something unreadable, something that was not part of the Enclave's programming. It was a brief, fleeting spark of something else, something that made his breath catch. What are you, Unit 734? He asked, the question a soft, dangerous whisper in the sterile silence. The question hung between them, a promise and a threat, and in that moment, Elian knew that the fragile, manufactured piece of his existence had just been irrevocably shattered. The simulation was designed to fail. It was a standard stress test for the Alpha squads, a cascading systems failure within a deep space relay station, compounded by a hostile boarding party. The objective was containment and survival against impossible odds. Elian's role, as always, was peripheral. He sat in the observation deck, a sterile glass-walled room overlooking the main training floor, his fingers flying across a data console. He was monitoring the simulation's integrity, a glorified technician, ensuring the virtual bullets felt real enough and the holographic aliens bled correctly. It was another exercise in invisibility. He was a ghost watching other ghosts fight a phantom war. Kyle was not in the observation deck. He was on the training floor, directing his alphas not as a commander, but as a participant. He moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold, a blur of black and grey, his commands sharp and precise amidst the cacophony of simulated weapons fire and explosions. The alphas followed him with perfect, deadly synergy. They were a pack, a single organism of violence and strategy. Watching them, Elian felt a pang of something he refused to name, a longing for a connection, for a place that he knew he could never have. He was and would always be other. The simulation progressed as expected. Squad Alpha, led by Rorik, was methodically clearing the station, while Squad Beta, under Kyle's direct command, secured the reactor core. Then, something went wrong. Something not in the script. A flicker in the holographic display, a discordant screech of feedback through the comms. On his console, a string of corrupted code scrolled past too fast to read. A real glitch, not a programmed one. The other technicians in the observation deck barely noticed, their eyes glued to the tactical displays tracking the Alpha's progress. But Elian felt it. It wasn't just a visual or auditory anomaly. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant wrongness that vibrated up his spine. His suppressed senses, usually a dull, muffled echo, suddenly flared. It was like a pressure change in the air, a drop in barometric pressure that heralded a storm. A scent, faint and acrid, cut through the sterile air of the observation deck. The smell of burning ozone, of fried circuitry. Not virtual, real. System integrity is at 99%. A technician droned into his headset. All parameters are stable. No, Elian whispered, his hands freezing, over the console. His eyes darted from the code to the training floor. Squad Beta was moving into the simulated reactor chamber. Kyle was at the lead. The wrongness was centered there, a knot of impending disaster. His heart hammered against his ribs. The protocols were clear. Observe, report, do not interfere. He was Unit 734. He was an Omega. His input was not required. It was not wanted. But the feeling was growing stronger, a silent scream in his mind. The scent of burning electronics was getting stronger, and he could feel a low-level vibration through the floor. The simulation was failing, and it was going to take the training floor's hardware with it. The magnetic containment field for the holographic emitters was about to overload. It wouldn't be a harmless light show. It would be a massive electromagnetic pulse, powerful enough to fry every system on the deck, including the neural interface units the Alphas wore. At best, it would cause catastrophic system-wide damage. At worst, it could cause lethal neurological feedback. "Commander," Elian said, his voice tight. No one heard him. He fumbled for his comms link, his fingers clumsy and numb. "Observation to command. I'm detecting an unscheduled power fluctuation in the primary emitter grid for the training floor." The lead technician glanced over, his expression annoyed. "The grid is stable, 734. Keep your eyes on your console." "It's not stable," Elian insisted, his voice rising. The scent of ozone was sharp in his nostrils now. The vibration was undeniable. "The primary coolant line is failing. It's going to cascade. The magnetic containment will collapse." Rorik's voice crackled over the command channel, laced with contempt. "Is the Omega having a fit? Someone shut him up." Elian ignored him. His eyes were locked on Kale's form on the floor below. He was about to enter the chamber. "Commander Kale, abort the simulation. Evacuate the training floor. The emitter grid is going to blow." There was a moment of charged silence. The technicians were staring at him now, a mixture of shock and anger on their faces. He had broken every protocol. He had directly addressed the pack commander during a live exercise. He had challenged the integrity of the system. He was done. His career in the Enclave, his very existence here, was over. But then, Kyle's voice, calm and clear, cut through the static. "Hold position." The Alphas on the floor froze. Kyle tilted his head, his helmeted gaze seeming to lift, to pierce through the reinforced glass of the observation deck and find him. Even through the distortion of the helmet, Elian felt the intensity of that gaze. "Observation. Confirm Unit 734's report." The lead technician scrambled, his fingers flying across his own console. His face went pale. "Commander, there are micro-fluctuations, outside of normal parameters. Coolant pressure is—" "Commander, it's dropping, exponentially." "Evacuate," Kyle commanded, his voice losing none of its calm authority. "Now." The Alphas moved with an explosive speed that belied their discipline. They were out of the chamber and moving towards the exits in seconds. Just as the last Alpha cleared the main doors, the world dissolved into white light and a sound like tearing metal. The lights in the observation deck flickered and died, and the consoles sparked, plunging the room into emergency lighting. A wave of force shuddered through the entire level. On the training floor below, the holographic emitters exploded in a shower of sparks, and the magnetic containment field collapsed with a deafening boom. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the whine of failing systems and the panicked shouts of the technicians. Elian was on his feet, his hands pressed against the cold glass, his breath fogging the surface. He stared at the wreckage below, his body trembling with adrenaline and fear. He had been right. His senses, the very part of him they tried to erase, had saved them. The emergency door to the observation deck hissed open, silhouetting two figures against the red glow of the corridor. Kyle and Rorik. They entered the room, their presence immediately dominating the chaotic space. Rorik's face was a mask of fury. He strode directly to Elian, his hand grabbing the front of Elian's uniform, and slammed him against the glass. "What did you do?" Rorik snarled, his face inches from Elian's. The raw, aggressive scent of an enraged alpha flooded Elian's senses, a smell like hot metal and bloodlust. It was a scent designed to terrify, to force submission. Elian flinched, but met his gaze. "I did my job. Your job is to collate data, not have hysterical premonitions. You sabotaged the simulation." "Enough, Rorik." Kale's voice was quiet, but it cut through Rorik's rage like a surgeon's scalpel. Rorik froze, his grip tightening for a moment before he reluctantly released Elian, stepping back with a low growl. Kale walked forward, his boots crunching softly on a piece of shattered console plastic. He stopped in front of Elian, his expression unreadable in the dim red light. The other technicians scurried away, giving them a wide berth. Kale's eyes roamed over Elian, a slow, methodical assessment. He wasn't looking at him like a subordinate who had broken protocol, or even as a hero who had saved them. He was looking at him like a puzzle he was finally beginning to solve. "Explain," Kyle said. It was not an order to be obeyed, but a demand for a truth Elian didn't know how to articulate. "The system readings were normal," Elian began, his voice shaky. "But I felt it, a pressure change, a smell, the vibration." He gestured vaguely at the wreckage. "It wasn't in the data, it was in the air." "You felt it," Rorik scoffed from the side. "The Omega had a feeling." Kale didn't look at Rorik. His gaze remained locked on Elian. "The official report will state that you detected subharmonic frequencies outside the range of the Enclave's sensors, indicating an imminent hardware failure. Your quick thinking prevented loss of life and equipment." Elian stared at him, stunned. Kyle was covering for him. He was creating a plausible, technical explanation for something that was pure, unadulterated instinct. He was protecting him. The question was, why? "But Commander," Rorik protested, "he caused a panic. He overrode command structure." "He was correct," Kyle stated flatly, the words an undisputable finality. He took a small step closer to Elian, his voice dropping so only Elian could hear. "From tomorrow, you will be reassigned. You will report directly to me. We are going to find out just how far outside the normal range your senses can operate." He held Elian's gaze for a long moment, and the look in his eyes was no longer just analytical. It was proprietary. It was the look of a man who had just discovered a unique, powerful, and very dangerous new weapon, and had claimed it for his own. The cage had just gotten smaller, and the bars were now forged from the commander's own unyielding attention. The commander's office was a void, a perfect cube of black composite walls, a polished obsidian desk, and a single, unforgivingly ergonomic chair for visitors. The only light came from the star charts and tactical grids that drifted like silent, luminous nebulae across one entire wall. It was a room that absorbed sound, light, and hope. For the past 3 weeks, it had been Elian's new prison. He sat at a secondary console tucked into a corner, a satellite in Kale's silent, orderly universe. His new duty was to sift through raw, encrypted data streams from the outer zones, searching for patterns the Enclave's algorithms might have missed. It was grueling, mind-numbing work, but the task itself was not the punishment. The punishment was the proximity. Kyle was always there. He would sit at his desk for hours, perfectly still, a statue of command. He would read reports, issue directives, and attend to the endless logistics of running the Enclave, all with an economy of motion that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. But no matter what he was doing, Elian felt the constant peripheral weight of his attention. It wasn't overt. There were no long stares, no invasive questions like the ones that had followed the simulation disaster. It was quieter, more insidious. It was the way Kale would pause in his reading when Elian shifted in his seat. It was the slight tilt of his head when Elian's breathing hitched at a disturbing piece of data. He was being monitored, not by sensors or cameras, but by the finely honed senses of the apex predator he shared the room with. The rest of the pack treated him with a new kind of hostility. Before, he had been an object of pity and contempt. Now, he was an object of suspicion. Kale's sudden interest, his protection, had marked Elian as something other, something dangerous. Rorik, in particular, made his animosity clear. His reports, submitted through Elian, were clipped and dismissive. In the mess hall, he and his cronies would fall silent when Elian entered, their stares like physical blows. They saw a pet, a favored oddity. They couldn't understand that Elian felt more like a specimen under a microscope. Today, the silence in the office was particularly heavy. Kale had been reviewing personnel files for hours, his expression carved from granite. Elian tried to focus on the cascading lines of code on his screen, but his mind kept drifting. The sterile, controlled environment, the constant low-level stress, the scent of Kyle's authority, it was all beginning to wear him down. The edges of his carefully constructed composure were fraying. Deep within him, memories stirred, ghosts he had spent years trying to keep buried. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a scent so rich and alive it felt like a dream. A large, warm hand rested on his head, ruffling his hair. "You have your mother's eyes," a deep voice, full of laughter, had said. "But that stubborn chin? That's all me." He remembered looking up at a face he could no longer quite picture, a face framed by a wild, dark beard. He remembered the feeling of safety, a profound and absolute certainty that he was loved, that he was home. It was a memory from before the Enclave, before the fire that had taken everything. Elian flinched, a sudden, violent jerk. A single, sharp gasp escaped his lips. The memory was a shard of glass in his mind, its edges unexpectedly sharp. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his console. Across the room, the soft whisper of a data slate being set down was the only sound. Elian opened his eyes. Kyle was watching him, his storm-grey eyes narrowed with an intensity that made the air feel thin. The analytical curiosity was gone, replaced by something sharper, more focused. Report. Kyle's voice was low, but it cracked like a whip in the silence. Nothing, Commander, Elian managed, his voice strained. A data anomaly. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. Kyle rose from his desk. He moved with that unnerving silence, circling the desk to stand before Elian's console. He did not look at the screen. He looked only at Elian. Your file is heavily redacted, Unit 734. It lists your designation, your aptitudes, and your date of acquisition by the Directorate. But your history, your place of origin, your lineage, it is all classified. Level 10 clearance. Not even I can access it. Elian stared at him, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. Why was he telling him this? What did he want? The official record states you are an orphan, the sole survivor of a raider attack on an outer zone settlement, Kyle continued, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. But raiders are clumsy. They are brutal. They leave evidence. The settlement you came from was not attacked. It was sterilized, erased. No bodies were ever recovered. No wreckage was catalogued. It simply ceased to exist. Except for you. The blood drained from Elian's face. He felt cold, so cold. He remembered the fire, yes, but he also remembered the silence that came after. The unnatural, perfect silence. The smell of chemical cleaners, not smoke. Who are you, Elian? Kyle asked, and the use of his name, his real name, was a physical shock. He had not heard it spoken aloud in years. It felt alien, a relic from another life. I'm Unit 734, he said, the words a desperate, reflexive shield. No, Kyle said, his voice dropping even lower. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of Elian's chair, trapping him. His face was close, his scent, ozone, winter forest, cold steel, overwhelming. It was suffocating. You are the Omega, who can feel a system failure before it registers on any sensor. You are the sole survivor of an event the Directorate went to extraordinary lengths to erase. You are not just an anomaly. You are a loose thread in their perfect tapestry, and they do not tolerate loose threads. Elian's breath hitched. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his entire body. The carefully constructed walls of his psyche were crumbling, and the ghosts of his past were clawing their way out. The face of the man with the laughing eyes swam in his vision, and for the first time in a decade, he felt the searing, unbearable pain of that loss. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down his cold cheek. Kyle's expression shifted. The hard lines of the commander softened for a fraction of a second. That flicker of something unreadable was back in his eyes, stronger this time. It looked almost like recognition or regret. He reached up, his gloved thumb moving with an almost hesitant slowness, and brushed the tear from Elian's cheek. The touch was brief, a ghost of pressure against his skin, but it sent a jolt through Elian's entire nervous system. It was not a clinical touch. It was not a gesture of dominance. It was gentle. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Elian knew about Kyle, about Alphas, about the Enclave, that it shattered the last of his control. A choked sob broke from his throat. He hated the sound, hated the weakness. He was an Omega, fulfilling their every expectation. Kyle straightened up, pulling back, the moment broken. The commander was back, his face a mask of cold authority. But his eyes, when they met Elian's, held the echo of that strange, gentle moment. The data you are analyzing, he said, his voice once again formal and distant, is not random. It contains encrypted logs from Directorate operations in the outer zones from 10 years ago. Find the pattern, Unit 734. Find out what they were looking for. Find out what they found when they came to your home. He turned and walked back to his desk, leaving Elian trembling in the sudden, vast space he had left behind. He was no longer just a specimen to be observed. He was a tool, a key, and Kyle was pointing him at the lock of his own buried, terrifying past. Kyle stood before the luminous wall of stars in his office, his hands clasped behind his back. The enclave was quiet, submerged in the deep, artificial night of its third cycle. The only light was the cold, distant glow of the star chart, its constellations and nebulae painting his severe features in shades of blue and silver. He was alone, but the room was not empty. It was filled with the ghost of a scent, a faint, lingering trace of something that his own senses, honed and disciplined, struggled to define. It was the echo of Elian's distress, salt and ozone, and a fragile, heartbreaking hint of something wild and green, like crushed jasmine fighting its way through snow. It was a scent of profound, deeply suppressed grief, and it clung to the sterile air like a phantom. He closed his eyes, accessing his internal chronometer. 3 hours and 14 minutes since Unit 734, since Elian had been escorted back to his quarters by the silent, imposing medical officer. 3 hours since he had watched the Omega's carefully constructed composure shatter and had felt something within his own rigid control threaten to crack in response. His gesture, the touch to Elian's face, had been an impulse, a severe breach of protocol, a lapse in the cold, calculated strategy he had been executing for years. He was the commander. He was the embodiment of the Enclave's order. He did not do impulse. He was not supposed to feel. For alphas in his position, emotion was a liability, a variable to be ruthlessly purged. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of detachment, building a fortress of discipline around a core of purpose. Yet, watching Elian's single tear trace a path down his cheek had felt like a physical blow. It had bypassed his walls, his training, his very title, and struck something older, something he had thought long dead. Cale opened his eyes and turned to his desk. With a flick of his wrist, a holographic file shimmered into existence above the obsidian surface. File, Unit 734, Designation, Omega. It was the same file he had studied countless times, its contents committed to his memory. Cognitive scores in the 99th percentile. Analytical skills unparalleled. Physical endurance low. Emotional regulation volatile, requiring maximum chemical intervention. Below that, the wall of black, redacted text. Classified. Level 10. He ran his fingers through the holographic text, the light clinging to his gloves. He couldn't bypass the encryption, not directly. The Directorate's security was absolute. But he didn't need to. He already knew what was hidden in the shadows of that file. He had been there, not at the final event, the sterilization of Settlement Sierra 9, but he had been part of the initial survey team years before. A young, promising alpha officer under the command of a man whose name was now spoken only in whispers. They had been told they were searching for strategic resources. A lie. They were hunting. The Directorate had detected a genetic anomaly, a bloodline of Omegas whose sensory and empathic abilities were not a weakness, but a staggering strength. They weren't just receptive to emotional and environmental shifts. They could perceive and interact with complex data systems, with energy fields, with the very fabric of the Directorate's technology on an intuitive, almost psychic level. They were living keys, capable of unlocking any system, bypassing any code. They were a threat to the Directorate's absolute control, and so they had to be erased, or if possible, weaponized. Kyle remembered the reports. He remembered the primary target, the Matis family, a lineage known for producing Omegas of unprecedented ability. He remembered the face of the family's patriarch from a surveillance file, a man with a wild, dark beard and laughing eyes, a man who had led a small, desperate resistance against the Directorate's encroachment. And he remembered the final report on the family's youngest son, Elian, a child with latent abilities that promised to eclipse all his ancestors, a child who had disappeared during the chaos of the final purge. The Directorate believed him dead, lost in the collateral damage of the sterilization. But Kale had never been certain. For 10 years, he had climbed the ranks, embedding himself deep within the system that had murdered his conscience. He had become the perfect soldier, the perfect commander, all while searching for a ghost. He had combed through thousands of acquisition files, cross-referencing data points, looking for a single brilliant Omega youth who appeared out of nowhere, his past a convenient blank slate. And then, 6 months ago, he had found him. Unit 734, assigned to his own enclave, a clerical oversight, a deliberate test by the Directorate. It didn't matter. The ghost had walked into his orbit. His observation of Elian had not been the predatory assessment of a dominant alpha. It had been the desperate, cautious study of a man trying to verify the impossible. He had watched Elian for signs of the Matis lineage, for any flicker of the extraordinary abilities the files described. He had seen glimpses, Elian's uncanny ability to predict minor system fluctuations, his intuitive understanding of complex data. But it was all muted, buried under the chemical sludge of the suppressants. The simulation failure had been the first true confirmation. Elian hadn't just detected a fault, he had felt the system breaking. It was the Matis gift, raw and untamed. And Kyle knew, with a cold, terrifying certainty, what he had to do. The Directorate had created the enclaves, these sterile fortresses of control, and networked them together into a single, monolithic system, a system he intended to break. He had spent a decade searching for a weapon, a key, and now he had him. But the ghost he had found was not a weapon. He was a boy who had lost everything, a survivor haunted by a past he couldn't even remember, a young man who looked at him with terrified, defiant eyes. The touch, the impulse to wipe away that tear had been a moment of profound, dangerous weakness. It was the man, not the commander, who had acted, the man who saw not an asset, but a victim of the same cruel system he was trying to destroy. He was not an asset, he was not an experiment, he was a person, and Kyle had just pointed him toward a truth that could destroy him. Was it strategy, or was it cruelty? For the first time in a long time, Kyle wasn't sure. He dismissed the file and brought up another one, a blueprint of the Enclave's central power core. Intricate lines of energy conduits and coolant systems filled the air. He traced a single, vulnerable nexus point with his finger. To bring down the Directorate, he needed Elian, not just his abilities, but his trust. A trust he had no right to ask for and no idea how to earn. He was the commander. He was the cage. How do you convince a prisoner that you are, in fact, the key to his freedom? You don't. You simply unlock the door and hope he is brave enough to walk through it. His plan was entering a new, far more dangerous phase. He would have to push Elian, test his limits, and force him to become the weapon the Directorate had always feared. and he would have to do it while protecting him from the very system he commanded. The contradiction was a blade pointed at his own throat. The power failed at 0217. One moment, the commander's office was bathed in the cool, blue-white light of the holographic displays. The next, it was plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. The ever-present hum of the enclave died, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against Elian's eardrums. For a single, terrifying beat, he was suspended in a sensory void. Then the emergency systems kicked in. Angry red light strips flickered to life along the floor and ceiling, casting the room in a hellish, crimson glow. A low, insistent alarm began to pulse, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic pounding of his own heart. Elian's hands flew from his console as if it were burning. He was on his feet, his body coiled with a sudden, primal fear. A power failure of this magnitude was unheard of. The Enclave had triple redundant power systems. This wasn't a glitch, it was a catastrophic failure. Across the room, Kyle was a silhouette against the dying star chart on the far wall. He hadn't moved. He stood with the same unnerving stillness he always did, a dark monolith in the flickering red gloom. "Status," he commanded, his voice calm, cutting through the alarm. "Total power failure in the primary and secondary grids," Elian responded, his training taking over, forcing the words past the lump of fear in his throat. "Tertiary backup is failing to engage. The entire sector is dark." "The suppressants," Elian whispered, the realization dawning with a wave of cold dread. "The automated medical dispensers, the atmospheric regulators, everything that held his Omega nature in check ran on the main power grid. Without it, the carefully maintained chemical dam inside him was about to break. He could already feel it. A tingling under his skin, a strange, dizzying rush as his senses, long muffled and sedated, began to awaken. The world was sharpening at the edges. The scent of ozone from the failing electronics was suddenly knife-sharp. The rhythmic pulse of the alarm was a physical blow against his skull. And Kale's scent. Oh gods, Kale's scent. Before, it had been a muted, authoritative presence. Now, it was a force of nature. It flooded the room, overwhelming, complex, and terrifyingly potent. It was the scent of a winter storm, yes, but now he could pick out the individual notes, the clean, sharp smell of cold air, the deep, earthy scent of ancient pines, the tang of lightning striking stone. It was the scent of absolute, untamed alpha power, and Elian's awakening instincts screamed at him in a language of pure panic. Threat, predator, run. He backed away, stumbling into his chair. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling. A wave of heat washed through him, a biological response he hadn't felt in a decade. It was the precursor to a presentation, a heat, a need. Mortification warred with terror. To be so exposed, so vulnerable, in front of him. "Unit 734, regulate your breathing," Kyle ordered, his voice still impossibly level. But he had turned, and even in the dim light, Elian could see the subtle shift in his posture. He was more alert, more focused, like a wolf scenting something new on the wind. "I can't," Elian gasped, pressing a hand to his chest as if he could physically hold himself together. And then his own scent, his true scent, began to bloom in the air. It uncurled from him like a ghost, freed from its chemical prison. It was a scent he barely remembered himself, a fragrance from a life lived before the Enclave. It was not the cloying sweetness of a typical Omega. It was something wilder, more complex. Jasmine, yes, but a night-blooming jasmine, laced with the sharp, clean scent of rain on dry earth, and a strange, metallic hint of ozone, like a reflection of Kale's own. It was the scent of his lineage, the scent of a Matis Omega. He saw Kale's nostrils flare. He saw the muscles in his jaw clench. The commander took a half-step forward, then stopped, his body rigid with a control that was visibly costing him. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a tension that was no longer just about authority and submission. It was something older, more elemental. It was the raw, undeniable chemistry of Alpha and Omega, stripped bare of all social and military artifice. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, for the aggression, the dominance, the loss of control that all the manuals warned of. He was exposed, his scent a beacon of vulnerability in the dark. He was prey, but the attack never came. Instead, he heard Kale's steady, measured footsteps approaching. He flinched when Kale stopped in front of him, but still, nothing happened. He dared to open his eyes. Kale was looking at him, and his face, illuminated by the pulsing red light, was a battlefield. His grey eyes were dark, almost black, his pupils dilated. Elian could see the struggle, the war between the disciplined commander and the primal Alpha. But beneath it all, in the deepest depths of his gaze, was something that stopped Elian's breath. It was not hunger. It was not aggression. It was recognition. A profound, soul-deep recognition that went beyond scent, beyond designation. It was the look of a man finding something he thought was lost forever. Jasmine and ozone, Kale murmured, his voice rough, strained. I remember that scent. Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. What? Your mother, Kale said, the words seeming to be torn from him. Her name was Lena. She was a botanist. She smelled of the rare flowers she cultivated in her lab. And your father. He was a systems engineer. Always smelled faintly of charged particles and soldering flux. He looked at Elian, and the last of the commander's mask seemed to crumble away, leaving only the man. I was a junior officer on the first survey team to your settlement. I met them. I spoke with them. They were good people. The world tilted on its axis. This man, this symbol of his oppression, this cold, calculating commander, knew his parents. The fragmented memories, the laughing man with the beard, the feeling of safety. It all rushed back, given context and a terrible, sharp-edged clarity by Kyle's words. He wasn't just a ghost from a redacted file. He was real. He was Lena and Marcus Mattis's son. You knew them, Elian whispered, the words tasting of disbelief and a decade of buried grief. I did, Kyle confirmed, his voice raw. And I was part of the system that took them from you. I never forgot. I never forgave myself. The alarm continued its relentless pulse, a heartbeat for a dying world. In the red-lit darkness, trapped together by a system of their own making, the commander and his prisoner stared at each other, no longer separated by rank or designation, but bound by a shared, tragic history. The power failure hadn't just plunged the enclave into darkness. It had brought a devastating truth to light. Kyle wasn't his jailer. Not entirely. He was something far more complicated. He was a witness. He was a penitent. And the unnerving, constant watch he had kept over Elian was not about control. It was an atonement. The aftermath of the revelation was a new kind of silence. The emergency power eventually stabilized into a low, steady hum, replacing the frantic alarm with an oppressive quiet. The red emergency lighting remained, painting their world in shades of blood and shadow. They stood in the commander's office, two figures, frozen in a tableau of shattered reality. Elian's mind was a maelstrom of fragmented memories and raw, surging emotions. Kale's confession had not brought comfort. It had brought an agonizing, brilliant pain, the pain of a wound suddenly exposed to the air. His parents had names. They had faces, histories. They were not just casualties in a redacted report. They were real, and Kale, his captor, had known them. The scent of his own awakened Omega nature still filled the air, a constant, humiliating reminder of his vulnerability. But Kale made no move. He stood a respectful distance away, his posture rigid, his face a mask of profound, weary regret. The primal tension between them had not vanished, but it had been transmuted. It was no longer the simple, terrifying dynamic of predator and prey. It was now laced with the far more complex threads of guilt, grief, and a shared, unspoken history. "Why?" Elian finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why tell me now? Why watch me all this time?" "Because I couldn't be sure," Kyle answered, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room. "Not until I saw the proof of your lineage, your abilities, the simulation, your reaction to the power failure. It confirmed what I had only suspected. You are Elian Mattis." He finally looked at Elian, his eyes holding a lifetime of unspoken burden. "And because the Directorate is hunting for something they lost 10 years ago, a key. They are re-examining old files, reopening cold cases. They are getting closer to realizing their mistake, that you were not eliminated. My watch over you was not to control you. It was to hide you in plain sight, to monitor you, yes, but also to protect you from being discovered before you were ready." "Ready for what?" Elian shot back, a surge of anger cutting through his grief. "Ready to be your weapon, your tool to fight them?" A flicker of pain crossed Kyle's face. "Yes," he admitted, the word stark and honest. "I won't lie to you. Your abilities, the Matti's gift, it's the only thing I have found that can interface with the Directorate's core programming on a quantum level. It's the only way to dismantle the system from within. I need your help, Elian. But I see now I have gone about this in the worst possible way. I treated you like an asset because it was easier than facing what was done to you, to your family." A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. The power dynamic had been irrevocably broken. Kyle was no longer the unassailable commander, and Elian was no longer the compliant, terrified unit. They were two people caught in the gears of the same machine, each holding a piece of the puzzle that might destroy it. In the days that followed, their interactions changed. Kale moved Elian's workstation from the corner of his office to a console directly opposite his own desk. It was no longer the arrangement of a commander and his subordinate, but of two collaborators. The work continued, but its purpose was now clear. They were no longer just searching for patterns. They were searching for weaknesses in the Directorate's network. Kyle began to subtly train him. He would create small, isolated system anomalies, a corrupted data packet, a ghost signal, and guide Elian to feel them out, to trace them to their source using his burgeoning sensory abilities. "Don't use the diagnostic," Kale would say, his voice a low murmur across the desk. "Close your eyes. Feel the flow of data. Where is the disruption? What does it feel like?" At first, it was frustrating, disorienting. Elian was trying to grasp smoke, but slowly, painstakingly, he began to learn. He learned that a viral code felt like a sharp, cold splinter in the warm hum of the data stream. A hardware malfunction felt like a dull, throbbing ache. He was learning to see with senses he never knew he had. And as his abilities grew, so did the danger. Rorik's suspicion festered into open animosity. He saw Kale and Elian huddled over consoles, speaking in low tones, and interpreted it as a sign of the commander's compromised authority, of a disturbing and unnatural favoritism. "The Omega is a distraction, Commander." Rorik confronted Kale one cycle in the corridor, his voice a low, challenging growl. Elian was a few paces behind Kale, and he froze, the Alpha's aggression a palpable wave. "The pack is unsettled. Your focus is divided. They whisper that you are being influenced." Kale turned slowly, his height and sheer presence dwarfing his second in command. "My focus is where it needs to be, Rorik," he stated, his voice dangerously calm. "And the pack's morale is your responsibility. See to it." He held Rorik's gaze until the other Alpha looked away, his jaw tight with resentment. It was a clear dismissal, a reassertion of dominance, but the challenge had been made. The pack's loyalty was fracturing. The tension between Kale and Elian was also changing. The fear Elian had felt was slowly being replaced by a tentative, dangerous trust. He saw the immense burden Kale carried, the lonely weight of his one-man war against an untouchable enemy. He saw the guilt in the commander's eyes every time he looked at him, and Kale, in turn, began to see past the Omega designation, past the powerful genetic key he needed. He saw the resilient, intelligent young man who had survived the unthinkable. He saw the flicker of his father's stubbornness in the set of his jaw, the echo of his mother's quiet intensity in his focused gaze. One night, as they worked late, Elian stumbled upon a heavily encrypted file buried deep within the archives. It wasn't a directorate file. The encryption was older, cruder. He focused, reaching out with his mind, feeling the shape of the code. It felt familiar, like a half-remembered song. "Kyle," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. It was the first time he had used it. Kyle looked up from his work, his expression unreadable. "This file, the encryption. I think it's my father's." Kale was at his side in an instant, leaning over his console. "Can you open it?" "I can try," Elian whispered. He closed his eyes, filtering out the hum of the station, the scent of the recycled air, the overwhelming presence of the Alpha beside him. He focused only on the file, on the familiar cadence of the code. He didn't break it. He resonated with it. He hummed the right frequency, and the locks simply fell away. The file opened. It wasn't data logs or technical schematics. It was a message, a single audio file, and a string of coordinates. Elian's hand trembled as he activated the audio. A voice filled the silent office, a voice he knew from the deepest, most protected corners of his memory. It was the laughing, warm voice of his father. "Elian," the voice said, and a fresh wave of grief washed over him. "If you are hearing this, then the worst has happened, and I am so sorry. But you are not the end of our line. You are the beginning. The Directorate thinks our gift is a key to control their systems. They are wrong. It is a key to dismantle them. They are a cancer, and our bloodline holds the cure. The coordinates, they lead to a place called the Empyrean, a sanctuary, a place where others like us are waiting. You are not alone. Never forget who you are. Never forget where you come from. I love you." The message ended. The silence that followed was deafening. Elian stared at the screen, tears blurring the string of numbers. He was not just a survivor. He was a legacy, He had a purpose handed down to him from a ghost. He looked up at Kale, whose face was a mixture of awe and grim understanding. The path forward was no longer a question of if, but when, and it would lead them both into the very heart of the storm. The discovery of his father's message was a fulcrum upon which Elian's world tilted. The grief was still a raw, open wound, but now it was tempered with a sense of fierce, burning purpose. He was not just a victim. He was the son of Marcus Mattis, a keeper of a legacy, a carrier of a promise, the Empyrean. The word itself was a beacon of hope in the sterile greyness of the enclave. He was not alone. The knowledge settled deep in his bones, a new and unfamiliar foundation of strength. He and Kale began to work with a feverish intensity. The coordinates from his father's message pointed to a dead sector of space, a region littered with stellar debris and navigational hazards, the perfect place to hide a secret. Their objective was now twofold: to find a way to transmit the location of the Empyrean to any other potential survivors scattered by the Directorate, and to create a large enough disruption in the Enclave's network to cover their own escape. It was a plan bordering on suicidal. Kale pushed him harder than ever, but the training was different now. It was a partnership. He taught Elian to shield his mind, to hide his unique energy signature from the Enclave's internal sensors. He showed him how to create psychic backdoors in the code, to weave his own consciousness into the data streams so that he could navigate them unseen. "Your father designed systems," Kale explained one night, his voice low as they studied a schematic of the Enclave's central server hub. He understood that any perfect system has a flaw, a human element that can be exploited. The Directorate's network is the same. It is vast, powerful, but rigid. It cannot comprehend intuition. It cannot fight what it cannot quantify. That is your advantage. You are the ghost in their machine. As Elian's power grew, so did the physical toll. The constant mental exertion left him exhausted, and the incomplete suppression of his Omega biology threw his system into chaos. He was caught in a strange, painful limbo, neither fully suppressed nor fully natural. He felt everything more acutely: the tension in the pack, the oppressive atmosphere of the Enclave, and the constant, thrumming presence of Kale. The Alpha's scent was no longer just a threat. It was a strange, grounding anchor in the dizzying sea of his awakening senses. It was a paradox that he didn't dare examine too closely. Their clandestine work did not go unnoticed. Rorik's surveillance of them became more overt. He would appear in the corridors when they left the office, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He assigned Alphas loyal to him to guard the command level, a transparent excuse to monitor their activities. The Enclave was becoming a pressure cooker, and Rorik was turning up the heat. He was convinced Kyle was compromised, that the Omega had somehow corrupted their leader. In a way, he was right. Kale was no longer the cold, detached commander he had once been. The certainty in his eyes was still there, but it was now tempered with a weariness, a vulnerability that only Elian could see. The burden of his deception, his long war, was beginning to show. The breaking point came when Elian, deep within the Enclave's network, found what they had been searching for: the core command protocols for the entire sector fleet. It was the Directorate's central nervous system, the code that controlled everything from fleet movements to the suppression schedules in every enclave. And buried within it, he felt a flicker of something else, something dark and predatory, a hidden subroutine, dormant but alive. "Kale," he whispered, his eyes wide with dawning horror as he stared at his console. "There's something else in here. A kill switch. It's called Protocol Chimera." Kale was at his side in an instant, his face grim as he read the lines of code Elian had isolated. "Chimera," he breathed, a look of cold realization on his face. It was a theoretical weapon, a bio-resonant frequency capable of targeting a specific genetic signature and triggering cellular breakdown. They wouldn't just kill their targets, they would erase them from existence. They designed it to hunt your bloodline. Elian felt a wave of nausea. This was how they had sterilized his home, not with bombs, but with a targeted, silent wave of energy that had simply unmade his people. And the protocol was still here, dormant, waiting. "But there's more," Elian said, his fingers tracing the lines of code as if they were alive. "It's tied to the Enclave's atmospheric and life support systems. It can be activated from within any Enclave's command core. And the trigger is a specific Omega pheromonal sequence." He looked up at Kale, the full, terrifying weight of the discovery settling upon him. "It's my scent. My genetic signature is the key that activates the weapon designed to destroy my own kind." The irony was so cruel, so perfectly vicious, that it was almost elegant. The Directorate hadn't just created a weapon, they had turned the very essence of their victims into the trigger. As this realization dawned, an alarm blared through the office, not the pulsing red of a power failure, but a high-pitched, strident security alert. On the screen, a new message flashed in bold block letters: "Unauthorized access detected in core command. Sector lockdown initiated. Rorik." He must have been monitoring their network activity. He had seen them touch the forbidden code and had sprung his trap. The heavy door to the office slid open, and Rorik stood there, flanked by 4 of his most loyal alphas. He held a stun rifle, its muzzle pointed squarely at Elian. His face was a mask of triumphant righteousness. "Commander Kyle," Rorik said, his voice ringing with authority, "you are relieved of command. Pending an inquiry by the Directorate, you have been compromised by this creature." He gestured at Elian with the rifle. "It has been using you to access our most secure systems. It is a spy, a saboteur." Kyle didn't even look at Rorik. His eyes were on Elian, and in them, Elian saw not fear, but a grim, resolute decision. The time for subterfuge was over. "Elian," Kyle said, his voice calm and clear, ignoring the armed alphas completely. "The Chimera Protocol, can you reverse the polarity? Can you use the system to broadcast a nullification wave instead of a kill frequency?" Elian's mind raced, processing the insane, brilliant possibility. To turn the weapon against itself, to use his scent not as a trigger for death, but as a key to broadcast freedom, a wave that could disable the suppression technology in every enclave in the sector. Theoretically, he breathed, but it would require a massive power surge directed through the central command core, and I would have to be physically interfaced with the core. "Then that is what we will do," Kyle stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. He finally turned to face his second-in-command. "Rorik, stand down. You have no idea what you are interfering with." "I know a traitor when I see one," Rorik snarled. "You've chosen this Omega over your pack, over your duty. Seize them." The alphas surged forward, but Kale moved faster. He was not a commander pushing data slates anymore. He was a warrior, a primal force of controlled violence. He moved in a blur, disarming the first 2 alphas with brutal efficiency, using their own momentum against them. The office erupted into chaos. Elian scrambled back as a stray stun blast vaporized the console where he had been sitting. Kyle was a whirlwind of black, holding off 4 trained alphas, his movements precise and deadly. But he was outnumbered. "The core," Kyle grunted, shoving an alpha into a bulkhead. "Go, I'll hold them off." Elian hesitated for only a second. Then he ran. He burst out of the office and into the corridor, the Enclave's lockdown alarms screaming around him. The path to the central command core, deep in the heart of the Enclave, was now a battlefield. He could hear the sounds of fighting behind him, the thud of bodies, the crackle of stun rifles. He had to trust Kale. He had to believe. He ran, his heart pounding with terror and a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a ghost in the machine, and he was about to become a god. The corridors of the Enclave had transformed into a death trap. Lockdown shutters of reinforced steel slammed down, sealing off sections, forcing Elian into a deadly maze. Automated defense turrets, sleek and white, descended from ceiling panels, their optical sensors glowing a malevolent red. The system that had once sustained him was now actively trying to kill him. Rorik had not just triggered a lockdown, he had activated the Enclave's most aggressive defense protocols, and it seemed Elian's unique energy signature was now designated as the primary threat. A turret swiveled, locking onto his position. A high-energy plasma bolt seared the air where his head had been a second before, leaving a molten scar on the bulkhead. He dove behind a support pillar, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a data analyst, not a soldier. He wouldn't survive this for 5 minutes. Then, a blur of black motion. Kale landed beside him, a low crouch, his breathing barely elevated. He had a stun rifle in one hand and a dark smear of blood on his temple. "Rorik has designated you a hostile entity to the mainframe," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "The automated systems will not stop until you are neutralized. We have to keep moving." "How did you?" Elian began. "They were loyal to the pack," Kyle cut him off, his eyes scanning the corridor ahead. "But I am their alpha. Their loyalty is to me, not to Rorik's ambition." He had not killed them, Elian realized. He had subdued them. He had reasserted his authority in the most primal way possible. 2 more alphas, their faces grim and resolute, appeared behind Kale. They were the few who had remained loyal to their commander over the system. "They'll cover our advance," Kale said. "The core is 3 levels down. Let's go." What followed was a desperate, brutal fight through the heart of the Enclave. It was a symphony of violence and strategy. Kale moved with a terrifying grace, his commands to his loyal alphas clipped and precise, his every action designed for maximum efficiency. He was the perfect warrior, the embodiment of the very system he was now tearing apart. He created openings, drew fire, and with his 2 alphas laid down a screen of suppressing plasma bolts that allowed Elian to sprint from cover to cover. Elian's mind was a whirlwind. His senses, fully awake and sharpened by adrenaline, were on fire. He could feel the flow of energy through the walls, the targeting solutions of the turrets before they fired, the emotional state of the alphas fighting beside him. A mixture of fear, loyalty, and fierce determination. He was no longer just running. He was anticipating. "Turret, left corridor 3 seconds, he yelled, and Kale reacted instantly, firing a perfectly aimed shot that struck the turret's power conduit just as it emerged. They moved as a single unit, a strange pack of 2 loyal alphas, a rogue commander, and the Omega Key, who could see the future a few seconds at a time. They were fighting their way through the guts of the machine, and Elian was its navigator. The bond between him and Kale had been forged in silent offices and under the weight of shared history. But here, in the fire and chaos, it was tempered into something unbreakable. A glance, a nod, a shared understanding that flowed between them faster than words. They reached the final access door to the command core. It was a massive vault door of solid titanium, sealed by a magnetic lock that could withstand a direct hit from a ship's cannon. The control panel beside it glowed red. Access denied. Rorik has locked us out from the bridge, one of the loyal alphas reported, his voice tight. We can't breach it. We don't have to, Kyle said, looking at Elian. Elian stepped forward, placing his hand on the cold metal of the door. He closed his eyes, shutting out the chaos of the firefight that Kale and his alphas were waging against, encroaching defense drones in the corridor behind him. He reached out with his mind, not to the control panel, but to the door itself. He felt the massive electromagnetic locks, the flow of power that held them in place. He remembered what Kyle had said. The system cannot fight what it cannot quantify. He didn't try to hack the code. He introduced a paradox. He pushed his own chaotic, organic energy signature into the cold, logical circuits. He didn't command it to open. He persuaded it. He made the system believe that it was failing, that the only way to restore stability was to release the locks. The control panel flickered, flashing a stream of error messages. With a deep, groaning shudder, the magnetic clamps disengaged. The massive titanium door slid open. The command core was a cathedral of light and information, a cylindrical chamber 30 meters high, its walls lined with glowing conduits and holographic data streams. In the center, suspended in a web of energy beams, was a pulsating sphere of crystalline data storage, the heart of the Enclave. A narrow walkway led to a single interface terminal at its base. Go, Kyle urged, pushing him forward as he and his alphas took up defensive positions at the doorway, laying down a hail of fire to hold back Rorik's forces. We'll buy you as much time as we can. Elian ran. He sprinted down the walkway, the sheer scale of the core taking his breath away. This was it, the nexus, the place where he could either save everyone or doom them all. He reached the terminal, a simple console extending from the platform. A haptic interface port glowed, waiting. This was the point of no return. He would have to connect his own consciousness directly to the machine. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of ozone and raw power. He could hear the battle raging behind him, the shouts, the explosions. He could feel Kale's presence, a steady, unwavering anchor of courage and belief at his back. He was not alone. He placed his hand on the interface. The moment he made contact, the world dissolved. He was no longer in the chamber. He was everywhere. He was pure consciousness, adrift in a screaming, infinite ocean of data. He was the Enclave. He felt every system, every sensor, every beating heart within its walls. He felt the cold, predatory logic of the defense systems. He felt Rorik's hate and ambition, a discordant, angry noise. He felt the loyalty of the 2 alphas at the door, a warm, steady light. And he felt Kale, a blazing sun of determination, and something else. A fierce, protective emotion aimed squarely at him, so powerful it was almost painful. He found the Chimera Protocol. It was a coiled serpent of black, silent code, waiting in the heart of the system. He could feel its hunger, its purpose, and he could feel his own genetic signature, the key hovering near it. He remembered Kale's question. Can you reverse the polarity? He reached out, not with hands, but with will. He grabbed the serpent of code, and it fought back. It was a living thing, a digital parasite, and it tried to consume him. It showed him visions of his home, of the fire, of his parents turning to dust. It fed on his fear, his trauma. He almost broke. He almost let it win. But then, through the storm of data, he felt Kale again. A steady, grounding presence. A silent voice that was not a voice. A feeling that said, "You are not alone. I am with you." He drew on that strength. He stopped fighting the serpent. Instead, he absorbed it. He let his own organic, chaotic energy flow into it, overwriting its malicious code with his own grief, his own hope, his own fierce desire for freedom. He took the kill frequency and inverted it. He took the targeting system and expanded it, aiming it not at a single bloodline, but at the Directorate's technology itself. The suppressants, the control collars, the very systems that held everyone in bondage. He poured all of himself into it. His memories, his pain, his father's last words, his hope for the Empyrean. He felt his own scent, jasmine and ozone, not as a pheromone, but as a broadcast signature, a carrier wave for his message of liberation. He pushed the command. Execute. Back in the physical world, the crystalline core flared with an impossibly brilliant white light. A wave of pure energy, silent and invisible, erupted from it, passing through the walls of the enclave as if they weren't there. In the corridor, the defense turrets and drones sparked and went dead. On the bridge, Rorik screamed as his console overloaded, the system he commanded suddenly turning on him. Across the entire sector, in dozens of other enclaves, alphas, betas, and the few remaining omegas suddenly felt a chemical fog lift from their minds, their true senses returning for the first time in years. In the core, Elian collapsed, his connection severed. The backlash was immense, a psychic tidal wave that crashed over him. His last sensation was of the world going dark, and of strong arms catching him before he hit the floor. His last thought was Kale's name. Consciousness returned slowly, not as a sudden gasp of awareness, but as a gentle tide washing over a desolate shore. The first thing he registered was not sight or sound, but scent. For the first time in a decade, he could smell the world without the dulling filter of suppressants. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the unfamiliar, clean scent of pine and wet stone. There was the tang of antiseptic, the coppery smell of blood, his own, he realized, and beneath it all, a steady, grounding scent of winter forest and ozone. Kyle. Elian's eyes fluttered open. He wasn't in the enclave. The ceiling above him was not smooth, grey composite, but the dark, pitted rock of a natural cave. A single, primitive glow rod cast a warm, flickering light over the space, making the shadows dance. He was lying on a bedroll, a rough but clean blanket tucked around him. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain lanced through his side, and he gasped, falling back. Easy. Kyle's voice, quiet and close. He moved into the light, kneeling beside the bedroll. He looked different. His severe commander's uniform was gone, replaced by simple, dark fatigues, stained and torn. The cut on his temple was healing, and a new exhaustion was etched into the lines around his eyes. But the heavy burden of command he had always carried seemed to have lifted. He was no longer a symbol. He was just a man. "Where are we?" Elian asked, his voice a dry rasp. A cave system on the moon the Enclave orbited, Kale explained. He offered Elian a canteen, and he drank greedily. The water was cold and pure. We escaped in a maintenance shuttle during the chaos. Rorik and his loyalists were apprehended by the pack once the system went down. They woke up, and they chose their alpha over the Directorate's machine. He paused. Your wave, it did more than we could have hoped, Elian. It didn't just disable the suppressants in our sector. It created a cascading failure in the Directorate's entire network. It broadcast a message of system vulnerability. You've woken them all up. You started a revolution. Elian absorbed this, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of it. He, the lone, broken Omega, had shattered an empire. He looked down at his hands. They were his own again. The slight tremor was gone, replaced by a steady calm. He felt whole. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety that had been his companion for 10 years was simply gone. The others? Elian asked. The 2 alphas who fought with us? Jax and Lyra, Kale supplied their names. They made it. They're securing the perimeter. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes searching his face. The intensity was still there, but it was transformed. The analytical observation of a commander was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound concern. The watchfulness had finally, truly ended. Now, he was just seeing him. How do you feel? Quiet, Elian admitted. My mind. It's quiet for the first time I can remember. He met Kale's gaze. Thank you for catching me. A small, sad smile touched Kale's lips. It was the least I could do. The silence that fell between them was no longer tense or fraught with unspoken meaning. It was comfortable, easy, a silence between equals, survivors. They spent the next few days in the quiet of the caves. Kyle tended to Elian's injuries with a gentle, practiced efficiency. The pain in his side was from a plasma burn he'd taken during the escape, a wound he hadn't even registered in the chaos. As he healed, they talked. Kale told him more about his parents, sharing small anecdotes that brought their ghosts to life. He spoke of his own past, of his disillusionment with the Directorate, of the long, lonely decade he had spent plotting its downfall from within. And Elian, in turn, spoke of his fragmented memories, of his fear, of the crushing weight of his designation. He spoke of the Empyrean, the word now a tangible promise, not just a desperate hope. One evening, they sat near the mouth of the cave, watching the magnificent, scarred curve of the gas giant the moon orbited rise over the horizon. The stars were brilliant, unfiltered by atmospheric processes or viewports. They were real. What happens now? Elian asked, his voice soft. Now, we rest, Kyle said, his gaze on the stars. We heal. And then, we find your Empyrean. We find the others. The fight isn't over. You didn't end the war, you just gave us a fighting chance. He turned to look at Elian, the starlight catching in his eyes. You are their hope, Elian. A symbol. I don't want to be a symbol, Elian confessed. I just want to be me. I know, Kyle said, and his voice was filled with a deep, resonant understanding. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before it gently rested on Elian's shoulder. The touch was warm, solid. It wasn't a claim or a gesture of dominance. It was a connection, a quiet offering of support and companionship. Elian didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, a silent acceptance of this new reality between them. The old world of alphas and omegas, of commanders and units, had been burned away in the light of the collapsing system. Here, in the quiet dark, they were something new, They were two souls who had found each other in the wreckage. Kyle was no longer the monolith of authority, the symbol of Elian's confinement. He was the man who had seen his pain and chosen to stand with him, the one who had guarded his life at the cost of his own. And Elian was no longer the frightened, broken specimen. He was the catalyst, the survivor who held the key to the future. He looked at Kyle, truly looked at him, free from the haze of fear and suppressant drugs. He saw the strength, yes, but he also saw the loneliness, the regret, the quiet hope for redemption. He saw a man he was just beginning to know, a man he wanted to know better. He lifted his own hand and placed it over Kyle's, his fingers lacing with the alphas. Kyle's hand tightened around his, a silent, powerful affirmation. The future was a vast, unknown territory. The Directorate would regroup. There would be more battles, more loss. But for the first time in his life, Elian was not afraid. He was not a lone Omega in an alpha pack anymore. He was with his alpha, his partner, his Kyle, and together they would face the dawn. They would find their way home.